Chapter 6, The Media. What government does and why it matters. One area in which our government's role is intended to be minimal is the news media. The Constitution's First Amendment guarantees freedom of the press, and most Americans believe that a free press is an essential condition for both liberty and democratic politics. Today, the media play a central role in American politics, not only in setting the agenda of topics Americans think about and discuss, but also in swaying opinion on political issues, politicians, and candidates. Political candidates who receive positive news coverage gain momentum, pick up political endorsements, attract campaign contributions, and win support from voters. In the 2008 campaign for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, Barack Obama exceeded the media's expectation with his early win in the Iowa caucuses, in which he upset the frontrunner Hillary Clinton, earning him increased press attention and eventually leading the first African American to the White House. But candidates who disappoint media expectations see their political endorsements, campaign contributions, and polling numbers dwindle. The influence of the media on political candidates is just one example of the media's vitally important role in American democracy. Without the media's investigations, citizens would be forced to rely entirely on the information provided by politicians and the government, and would be deprived of an indispensable opportunity to evaluate issues carefully and to form reasoned opinions. The rise of the internet has fundamentally altered the media's role in politics and American democracy. Just 20 years ago, the majority of Americans got their political news from a daily newspaper, from radio, or by watching the local evening news and the national evening news from one of the three major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Today, America is becoming a nation of digital citizens, daily internet users who turn to the internet for politics and news. The Pew Research Center reports that 86% of Americans adult use the internet, up from 14% in 1995. Among internet users in 2012, 3 in 4 read the news online, and 6 in 10 go online for information about politics and campaigns. More Americans now read the news online than read a print newspaper, and those reading online news are more likely to vote and participate in politics in other ways. Today, mainstream media must compete with niche media outlets that tailor news to their readers and viewers. Americans find political content via blog and social media such as Facebook and Twitter. In 2013, more than 7 in 10 online adults use a social networking site, and as a result, hearing about news from friends and family via social media is growing. In Chapter 5, we examine the vital questions of how public opinion is related to government actions and decisions. We turn now to the most important way in which Americans learn information about their government, which in turn shapes people's opinion. Because most Americans do not have the time, ability, or opportunity to find directly what their government does on a day-to-day basis, they must rely on the media to inform them. Traditional media have always mattered in a democracy. Describe the role of print and broadcast media in providing political information. It is impossible to imagine democratic politics without vigorous media. The public, and therefore public opinion, depend on the news media to publicize and assess the claims of political candidates, to examine government policies and programs, and to revealed wrongdoing by government agencies and public officials. Without the information provided by the media, the public could not possibly know enough to play any role in national politics. Freedom of the press definitely belongs in the First Amendment as one of the first principles of democratic government. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, the basis of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right, and where it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government. Should have a government without newspaper or newspapers without a government. I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. Americans get their news from three main sources: broadcast media, radio and television, print media, newspaper and magazine, and increasingly the internet. Online sources have become a major source of news for Americans, just behind television broadcasts. The Pew Research Center's 2013 Benign Media Attitude Survey found that half of the public now cites the internet as a main source for national and international news. Television, 69%, remained the public's top source of news. Only 28% of Americans use newspapers and 23% use radio as their main news source. This picture is very different from that of a decade ago, when 44% said newspapers were the main source for news, and just 44% said newspapers were their main source of news, and just 24% used the internet as a primary source. The percentage turning to television for news has changed little over the past decade. Each of these sources has distinctive characteristics. We discuss trends in print and broadcast first, and then we look at online news and how it's changing the media industry and the way Americans get political news. Print media. Newspapers, though no longer the primary news source for most Americans, remain important nevertheless because they are influential among the political elites. The broadcast media also rely on leading newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post to set their news agenda. In fact, the broadcast media engage in relatively little original reporting. They primarily cover stories that have been broken or initially reported by the print media or online media. Print and online media as written text also provide more details and complex information than radio and television media, offering a better context for an analysis. The nation's economic, social, and political elites rely on the detailed coverage provided by the print media to inform and influence their views about important public matters. The print media may have a smaller audience than their cousins in broadcasting, but they have an especially influential audience. For most traditional newspapers, though recent decades have been competition from broadcast media and more recently free context online have combined with declining advertising revenue and circulation levels to undermine the traditional business model of newspapers, bringing financial disasters in traditional print media to traditional print media. Daily newspapers print circulation has declined from 62 million to 49 million nationwide over the past 20 years, while advertising revenues at print newspapers have dropped dramatically since 2006. As a result, newspapers have had to make dramatic cutbacks. Estimates indicates the size of newsroom staff is down 30% since 2000 industry-wide. Circulation for the New York Times dropped more than 10% from 2010 to 2011, and in 2011 alone, the newspaper lost 25% of its revenue. Major newspapers have sought bankruptcy protection, and others have gone out of business altogether. The Los The Los Angeles Times have reduced its news staff by half over the past decade. Newspaper cuts costs by closing their foreign bureaus and their offices in Washington, D.C. The effect of a decade of newsroom cutbacks are most evident in the political sphere. During the 2012 presidential election, a Pew report revealed that campaign reporters were acting primarily as megaphones rather than as investigators. Pew report revealed that campaign reporters were acting primarily as megaphones rather than investigators of the claims made by the candidates. This meant less reporting by journalists to interpret the claims represented by the candidate. And readers noticed this shift. Pew found that nearly a third of U.S. adults stopped turning to the news outlet because it is no longer providing them with the quality of news they were used to receiving. To counter these trends, traditional media or organizations have been forced to adopt, and most now have significant online presence, blurring the distinction between old media and new. Faced with shrinking revenues from their print version, a few news organizations, such as Washington Post and New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, charge customers for reading the news online, while others, such as Seattle Post, Intelligencers, and the Christian Science Monitor, are available only online. Recently, the success of paid digital news that is increasing revenue and improving content, including reviving long-form journalism. The newspaper industry may have finally righted itself in 2012 when 450 of the nation's 1380 dailies announced plans for paid content subscription, micro-payments, or paywall plans. The metered model allowed a certain number of free visits before requiring users to pay. If this approach succeeds, we may see more online subscription newspapers in the future and a more viable business model for the digital press. Television news reach more broadcast media. Television news reach more Americans than any other single news source. It is estimated that over 95% of Americans have a television, and tens of millions of individuals watch national and local news programs every day. Most television news, however, covers relatively few topics and provides little depth of coverage. Television news is more like a series of newspaper headlines connected to pictures. It serves the extremely important function of alerting viewers to issues and events, but with exceptions such as the Public Broadcasting System (PBS). Provides little more than a series of sound bites, brief quotes, and short characterizations of the day's events. Because they are aware of the characters of television news coverage, politicians and others often seek to manipulate the news by providing the media with sound bites that will dominate news coverage for at least a few days. 24-hour news stations such as cable news networks, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News offer more detail and commentary than the networks' half-hour evening news shows. Even CNN and the others, however, offer more headlines than analysis, especially during their primetime broadcasts. Radio news is essentially a headline service, but without pictures. In the short time they devote to news, usually 5 minutes per hour, radio stations announce the day's major event without providing much detail. In major cities, all news stations provide more coverage of major stories, but for the most part, the stations fill the day with repetition rather than details. All news stations assume that most listeners are in their cars and that as a result, the people in the audience change throughout the day as listeners reach their destination. Thus, rather than use their time to flesh out a given set of stories, these stations repeat the same stories each hour to present them to new listeners. In recent years, radio talk shows have become important sources of commentary and opinions. A number of conservative radio hosts such as Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity have huge audiences and have helped mobilize support for conservative political causes and candidates. In the political center or left center, National Public Radio, NPR, is a coveted source for moderate talk radio, providing in-depth political reporting, while the now defunct Air America hoped to achieve on the left what Limbaugh had achieved on the right. Comedy talk shows with political content, such as the Daily Show and The Late Show, have become increasingly important, attracting millions of television viewers. Comedian Stephen Colbert even established a political action committee, PAC, during the 2012 presidential primary in an effort to draw attention to problems with current campaign finance laws. The Daily Show and other late-night talk shows use humor, sarcasm, and social criticism to cover major political events. Yet these talk shows are not just for fun. They have become an increasingly important source of political news, especially for younger viewers. Pew surveys show that many Americans get political news from these shows and that followers of comedy talk shows are well informed about politics. Comedic, whatever the fuck that is. The broadcast media are also diversifying as they adopt a change in the American population, especially the growing number of Latinos. In California and Texas, as well as other states, the Latino-oriented television channel Telemundo envisioned the MSN Latino attract large audience by focusing on topics or perspectives of particular interest of their audience. Coverage of the Arizona-Alabama illegal immigration laws, for example, in Latino media outlets was significantly different from that of the mainstream media. News outlets aimed at other ethnic groups have also become common in many areas. As America has become more multicultural, multi-ethnic, television, a form of niche media, has broadened news media. The United States boasts nearly 2,000 television stations, approximately 1,400 daily newspapers, and more than 13,000 radio stations, 20% of which are devoted to news, talk, and public affairs. Despite these substantial numbers overall, the number of traditional news gathering sources operating nationally is actually quite small. Several wire services, 4 broadcast networks, public radio and televisions, a few elite newspapers and news magazines, and a smattering of other sources such as the national correspondence of a few large local papers and the small independent radio networks. More than 3/4 of the daily newspapers in the United States are owned by large media conglomerates such as the Hearst, McClatchy, or Gannett corporations. Much of the national news published by local newspapers provided by one wire service, the Associated Press, while additional coverage is provided by services run by several major newspapers such as the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. More than 500 of the nation's television stations are affiliated with one of the four networks and carry that network's evening news programs. Some of the most popular online news outlets are electronic versions of the conventional print or broadcast media. The trend towards less variety in traditional media has hastened by changes in media ownership, which became possible in large part as a result of the relaxation of government regulation in the 1980s and 90s. The enactment of the 1996 Telecommunication Act opened the way for further consolidation in the media industry, and a wave of mergers and consolidation has further reduced the field of independent media across the country. For example, the Australian press burned Rupert Murdoch owned the Fox network plus a host of radio, television, and newspaper properties around the world, known collectively as news corporations, the world's second largest media conglomerate. In 2007, Murdoch won control of the Wall Street Journal, consolidating his position as one of the world's most powerful publisher. News Corporations owns 800 media companies in more than 50 countries and has a network of over 5 billion. A small number of giant corporations now control a wide swath of media holdings, including television networks, movie studios, recording companies, cable channels, and local cable providers, book publishers, magazines, and newspapers. Clear Channel Communication, for example, a Texas-based media conglomerate, owns 850 radio stations, by far the largest number controlled by a single company. These developments have prompted questions about whether enough competition exists among the media to produce